way we might start talking, and this should be a conversation we are inviting with this whole workshop process, we're inviting to become a sharing, learning community. So I'm just going to begin briefly to think about our forest-tree policy that's dominated about the 22 million hectares of forest in British Columbia that are designated as the quote unquote managed forest, but they're managed for a single purpose. They're managed for timber value. Yes, there's some legislation that I happened to originate, but that turned into the Forest Practices Act from being the reforestation policy, which make companies accountable for all the other values. However, in the past century, we've managed our forests as for timber value, and we've managed them to protect that timber by preventing fire, where we now, and we've managed them to encourage trees. So we had 350 million cubic meters of pine on the landscape in 1900. And by the year 2000, we had a billion cubic meters of pine on the landscape. An infestation of pine waiting for an infestation of beetles, which were climate facilitated. But the consequence of timber-centric management is very simply the vulnerability to pests, fire, and disease that our forests exhibit today. Pre-contact, these lands, these forests were managed by indigenous fire ecologists. They burned very skillfully in timely ways. So there were light understory fires. They maintained heterogeneity. They encouraged the kind of hardwood stands that become like asbestos blankets across the landscape. There was a different forest, the old growth forests that we colonially we call them old growth forests. They are indigenous forests that were stewarded by the indigenous people, and the condition of those forests we treasure because they have all this biodiversity, this complexity, this resilience, even to climate change, compared to our forests that we've created and have planted 1.5 billion trees with our company in Canada. We've reforested closed canopy conifer stands, and we've protected and created them. And so when we're talking about climate projects, one of the concerns that I always have is that we don't become carbon-centric the way we were timber-centric in the past era of policies. And so when we begin to talk about climate projects, conditionally, it's very important. And the province, I have to credit the province, we've been working with, or I always experience against, how the province does its business for a long time. And we worked on a project for 5 or 6 years to invite the concept of co-governance and to include the framework of an integrated landscape planning process where all of the values are balanced, and you look for forests that have all of those values, all the indigenously recognized values, that complexity, and you try to return a forest to pre-contact qualities of resilience, qualities of abundance, and adaptively adjust your stand to anticipated change in climate. A very challenging concept, but we think there's a integrated landscape planning process, climate modeling through which you can think about this, but you need to work with it needs to be a co-governance approach. And from that, the province has introduced the idea of forced landscape planning, which they are thinking as a policy concept of pilots, a couple of pilots to begin that process of thinking about the whole landscape and all of its users, interests, values, and complexity And carbon should become a part of that process and entertain all values, not just be about carbon. So that's my opening comments. Let's have some discussion.
I just see a little note here from Brianna. Brianna, I don't know if you're in this particular one, but
looks like she is.
Yeah, I just wondered if you wanted to just talk about what you're doing, because this speaks to the very nub of the issue. Is the Stakea Education Society, Quetzin organization, is trying to do restoration on our Crown parklands, and there is not a lot of there's not a lot of institutional support and structures in place for this to happen. And maybe I don't know if you want, if I'm putting you on the spot or not.
Well, I'm not really able to share very much. I'm quite new to the project, so I'm quite limited to what I feel I can say at this point. So I'm not really. We're really in a learning stage. I'm with working with Indigenous youth right now. Really, we're just in a very getting to know each other, starting to do some research surrounding the watershed initiative, Healthy Watershed Initiative. So really, we're just really familiarizing ourselves with what this entails. So I am very, very limited. I'm afraid to offer anything other than that. But it was an amazing opportunity to be part of this today. We've enjoyed listening to everybody speak and comment. We're learning a lot. We realize we've got a lot to learn. It's a lot of new terminology for us, so we're just kind of taking it all in at this point. I'm sorry I don't have much more to offer at this point.
No, Brianna, I really did it more just to introduce everybody, because I think these are the kinds of projects that we would love to be able to support as a society, so that you don't have to spend, I think the nature of Indigenous stewardship for a lot of people has meant lots of grant writing, lots of, bake sales, and to be able to try and provide a funding mechanism for this great work to be done is kind of what's initiated my interest to support your work. And it's really it's such a privilege to be out with the youth on your land and seeing kind of what's possible. And so thank you for jumping in and me putting you on the spot like that. So I think this is sort of a continuation of the conversation we were having before, but Deb, I'm just wondering if you can sort of put some of these pieces together that both brings, what Dirk's talking about, and bring it down to this local level. And how do we, what are our next steps?
Yeah, I think that is the question, isn't it? And I really hear what Dirk's saying. I appreciate the question, because I think there is a tendency in policy making to start to think around singular solutions, like, okay, this is the problem, carbon, so the solution is decarbon, or carbon sequestration or whatever. And without taking a more holistic approach that actually looks at the history of place, that looks at the governance, co-governance, shifting governance, like whatever that looks like in place, and all of the different peoples involved and organisms involved in that place, and how we actually manage for all of that holistically is it's a different way of thinking than has historically been done in a lot of policy making. And ecosystem-based systems have originally started to move toward that, but they had a very sort of economic kind of transactional kind of mechanism inside them. Nature-based solutions are a little bit further along that spectrum, I think, around getting more to systems level management. And so, but really, honestly, what that really looks like in policy is still a bit of an open question. And so figuring out what some of those policies are is what we're in the middle of trying to do. And I noticed there's a number of other folks on the call here, like Claire, and I know Steve's been in the conversations, and Doug's been on the working groups too. Delaney's been involved in it. So like they can speak to the details too. But I think like one of the key ideas is how do we actually show some examples of what that can look like, what those co-management projects can look like. And you know, how do we do that? Not like that we have an idea what that project is and we seek a First Nations collaborator, but we actually co-create the idea with our First Nations collaborators of what that can be. And so, you know, we're a long way from doing that, I think, in governance itself. But hopefully all of the work that's being done right now by organizations like yourselves is actually moving us toward that, to be able to build those relationships and think through those ideas more clearly.
Yeah.
Briony, could I make I'd like to thank Brianna for describing a little bit of what she's doing with youth and that emergence of the stewardship, Indigenous stewardship, because projects do need co-governance. They need the whole Indigenous philosophy, their unique ecological knowledge, their sense of balance and how to navigate, because it's more complex now that our systems are changing. It's a very complex process. So we're going to be doing a lot of technical analysis, and there'll be some idea, there'll be some carbon project, but the only way that will stay on track and not become a disaster is if we have Indigenous stewards who are experienced, trained, rooted in their own culture, but local culture and local knowledge to guide and to observe and to be the kind of agency they have historically been on their own territory. And I've worked with events like that, which I talked about earlier in Briony and my presentation, where it's transformative for the community to have agency on their own territory. It's transformative to the well-being of the community, and it's transformative to the possibility of that co-governance structure that's necessary for nature-based projects. And so thank you for beginning the process, because that's the community that will make these young stewards. Some of them will become and teach others to be the guides, the guardians and the guides of what this process will unfold as over time.
Thanks, Dirk. David, you've had your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Briony. I guess this may be a little bit of a variation here, but I've heard a lot of talk about collaboration and co-management. I'm going to suggest that I'm seeing quite a lack of collaboration or co-management or reaching out to the private landowners that exist in the ENN belt and in the Islands Trust. I am a private managed forest landowner. Families had the property for well over 100 years. And I'm quite interested in carbon. I'm quite interested in recognizing the ecological values. I'm a professional forester, but I still come down to the fact that if I or anybody else needs or wants to make a little bit of money off my forest or my lands, I really have very limited options. Basically, it's log and flog for real estate. It's log and turned into a field or stick it under a greenhouse for agriculture, or it's log and reforest. And I'm desperately looking for a fourth and a fifth and a sixth option. And I'm looking for local governments to help with some of that. And my thoughts go to things like fuel management efforts, municipal natural asset infrastructure projects, that sort of stuff. but I just don't see any real uptake on that. And what I do see is a lot of people wanting to tell me how to manage my land. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, thanks, David. I won't bring it up, but I prepared a slide for all the different people that have an interest in this. And it really includes some of the calls for help are coming from woodlot owners, foresters who want to do the right thing, but the market is not there. And this is really this is a lot of the work that Dirk has spoken about came about for that very reason, and was to try and provide another revenue stream for foresters so they could actually afford to do a good job, given that there's been a real race to the bottom of the price of wood. So Dirk, maybe you can speak to these projects. These carbon projects can accommodate that. There's a lot of latitude and flexibility with the allocation of carbon revenue. So maybe Dirk, you can speak to that.
Dave, nice to hear from you. The logging less in exchange for some carbon revenues was not worthwhile, while the carbon price is $15, or it used to be much lower. When we first got engaged with carbon projects and they were not in Canada, the price was, $1.50, $2 became $4. The World Bank was offering $4 and something, thinking it was still not viable. The emission trading system in Europe, 2 weeks ago, I just checked, I don't track them often, but they were trading at $58.63 Canadian equivalent to the euro. And that's more like it. Now, the carbon price in Canada, I think this year it's $40. And if this government stays in place, or some government with a common will, it'll just keep getting higher. And so then the trade-off for some carbon on your landscape, as opposed to some timber value, and how we did that project with Cheakamus, the Cheakamus Community Forest, the end result for that's a larger project. The scale is very important. It's very hard to do all of the planning, modeling, filing, and registry work for a small property. It's a lot of work. However, a group of landowners could get together and do that. But what we did in Cheakamus, which was 32,000 hectares, that reduction enabled the Lillooet and Squamish nations, whose contract crews were working there, to modify, buy new equipment, modify their logging practice, start selection harvesting as opposed to smaller clear cuts at that time, but abandon clear cutting largely, and modify how they harvested that landscape in ways that, of course, reduced the volume logged in exchange for the carbon, and use that funding to log the rest of it sustainably. And that's largely how they made a shift. So the community benefits through more work because it's more labor intensive or expensive. And but of course, there are all these ancillary benefits. So, are there understory potential values on your landscape, mushrooms, other understory plants that are not currently going to market? Could you be thinking about some of that as a sustainable option? That's where I don't know your forest area, but I suspect there's possibly some value in that. But it's challenging, and it becomes possible to do at least volume instead of log and flog to not log and trade your carbon credits. And you may find a similar revenue stream, although of course the lumber price, because of the tragedies of climate on forest volume and some other factors, is through the roof now in the US. And that's that's competitive with my concept, but I don't think that price will stay there it'll come down, probably not to where it's been. But it's a completely different game with the higher carbon price that we have today than it was even a year ago.